Kentucky History 240-AOZ1, the online course. Kentucky just ahead. I thought that was kind of cute. It's actually a road sign somewhere from Kentucky. And here, of course, we have the Commonwealth of Kentucky's flag. We'll learn more about that, how it was designed and what it stands for, just a little bit later. And of course, the picture of Boone leading settlers to the Cumberland Pass is, when people see this, this is what they think about it for Kentucky and for Daniel Boone, him walking through, leading all these settlers. I think it's a pretty picture, but it didn't really happen. Before we really get started into the history of Kentucky, we need to go back a little bit further. 500 million years ago, as a matter of fact. As a matter of fact, we were all underwater. Not just Kentucky, but everything south of Kentucky and a little bit west. Because we were underwater, it was a very tropical hot, because the axis of the earth was tilted back more than it is today. And Kentucky was actually south of the equator, so we had very hot tropical weather. About 350 million years ago, the remnants of some of these dead organisms began to settle on the floor that had been growing, and they were filled with calcium carbonate, and they began to form what would later be the limestone beds and caves and sinkholes in southern Kentucky. 245 million years ago, the North American plates began to move around and shake, and they created the Appalachian Mountains. And when they did this, they redirected the water that had been flowing west back to the east. So you could say, because of tectonic erosion, the plates shifting, erosion of the water land through just natural sources, and deposits of the dead organisms in the water to the floor of the sea, it began to form what we call a unique physiographic region. I want to tell you a story. 18,000 years ago, our entire North American continent was pretty much covered with a glacier, 2 miles thick. As a matter of fact, it always went all the way down to pretty much where the Ohio River is now, Cincinnati, Louisville, St. Louis. It was all covered with 2 miles of glacier. I don't know about you, but I have difficulty even visualizing something that big. And of course, at the base of the glacier, there would be really, really cold. And all we had at that point in time was large woolly animals. And we had mastodons, we had mammoths, we had huge big elephants with these big tusks, long shaggy haired things. And sometimes these animals, of course, would get thirsty, and they'd find them a salt lick or salt springs. And if they weren't careful, they'd get trapped in quicksands, and then the other cats or predators would move in and, of course, feast on the helpless animals. And sometimes the predators would even get stuck. Because we have found bones of prehistoric animals at the Blue Lick Salt Springs, and at Licking River, and at the Big Bone Lick, which is named because of the big bones that we found there. And there's also even been some dinosaur tracks found. Now, that mastodon is a member of the elephant family. And the elephant and the mammoth, they both originated in Africa and spread like people did across Siberia through the Bering Strait, which was covered with ice about this time, some 25 million years ago. And the glaciers were very slow in retreating. It wouldn't be until about 8,000 years ago that the present-day United States was even totally ice-free. But I don't know if you're aware of it or not, but during the Ice Age, North America was home to not only the mastodons and the woolly mammoths, but we had giant bison with horn spread of 7 feet, and giant deer, we had antelope, we had camels, we had horses, we had giant ground sloths, and we had beavers as large as the big black woolly bears now. And we had lions and saber-toothed tigers. But about 10,000 years ago, we did have an extinction, and it's been theorized and pretty much proven that a glacier, not a glacier, but a meteorite coming in at a low angle hit in what is right now the Gulf of Mexico and caused a gigantic cloud to hide the sun and kill off vegetation. And when the vegetation died, the vegetable-eating animals died. And when a lot of your vegetable-eating animals died, a lot of your meat-eaters died because they didn't have anything else to eat too. And a very few thousand years later, a lot of them were extinct, like the dinosaurs. And there's also some theory that man just overkilled a lot of them, which I think man did, but only to a small point. We've got carbon dating tests now, and bones of some of these ancient animals have been found. Embedded in some of their bones are what we call little tiny Clovis arrow points. And they're called the Clovis arrow points because they were first discovered in Clovis, New Mexico. Somehow or another, knowing how big the people were 10, 12,000 years ago, I mean, they were really small. I mean, 4 foot, 4 foot 2, 3. I just can't see them hunting to extinction the dinosaurs and the woolly mammoths, but be that as it may, that's the way it goes. So you can say that, like I say, tectonic plates moving, erosion, and the deposit actions formed our very unique geographic area. Now, I was unable to get the information I wanted on this slide, so the next slide has the information, so I'll go back and forth. This is basically a breakdown of all the areas of our state. You got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 areas. And of course, over here, the Mississippi embayment, which is also known as the Jackson Purchase. That's where the Mississippian Indians lived. And of course, the Mississippians were known as mound builders. And it's very southern in its attitude. If you've ever been down to Paducah, you know what I'm talking about. It's like going to a whole different world down there. And they grew cotton, and during the Civil War, they were very much for the South. Immediately to the right, we have the Mississippi Plateau, or we could also call it the Pennyroyal or Pennyroyal. There's 35 counties there. It's 30% of the entire state. Of course, you've got Bowling Green down there, and that's where Mammoth Cave is, LBL, and the TVA. Lots of rivers, and we've got something called a karst. And you know what karst? Have you ever heard that word before, karst? I think you'll find I like different words. I like unusual words. Karst is a description of well, it's a Slavic word, and it refers to a description of a landscape that produces sinkholes and caves and springs and disappearing streams. And of course, the Pennyroyal is famous for that because the Mammoth Cave. And as a matter of fact, at Murray State University, they have a karst study program down there. Okay, so we've got the Purchase, we've got the Pennyroyal, and we've got the Western Coalfield, which is where we are in our area, Owensboro, Henderson, Paducah, and predominantly coal mining. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the western area because we're going to spend time on that a little bit later in this area. So we got the Purchase, you've got the Pennyroyal, you got the Western Coalfield, and you've got the Eastern Coalfield. It's also known as the Cumberland Plateau. Very little level land. It's very rugged and hilly, and one of the most beautiful areas of our state. Of course, we've got the Appalachian Mountains there, and it's known for poverty and illiteracy. The people there are very superstitious and religious too. Immediately to the left of that, you've got the bluegrass area. You've got two different shades. You've got the inner bluegrass and the outer bluegrass, but we're just going to talk about one bluegrass. Very rich soil. Tobacco's grown there. You get the horse farms. You got Lexington. You got Frankfort. It's also the most well-known area of our state and the place where the earliest settlers settled because, they didn't have any type of chemistry, and they didn't know why something looked good. They'd look at the trees and the plants, and if they looked good, they said, well, the ground is fertile. But this, and the rivers too, contribute. In fact, this is where they stopped. Now, right around the bluegrass area, you've got an area called the Knobs. This goes all around the outer bluegrass. It's an area of gently rolling hills. Excuse me. It's kind of like a necklace around bluegrass. Now, I placed Louisville in that area primarily because it's right there on the line. It could be either bluegrass or Knobs. And since the bluegrass area has Frankfort and Lexington, let's give the Knobs Louisville. So this is basically the physiographic area. And like I say, I do have this list here. It's all from in your text anyway. And we've got 120 counties, and no, I do not think that you need to learn all of them. There is a bunch of counties there. And of course, here's Davis County right here. We'll get into the formation of the counties, and I would like you to know the immediate area, but there won't be any questions on counties. That's too sophomoric. But the surrounding states, now I tried and tried, ladies and gentlemen, and I just couldn't figure out how to go about this, so I took the outline of the map, and the surrounding states, over here to the far left of your screen is Missouri. And then right in here, you've got a state called Illinois, Indiana, Ohio. Then you've got West Virginia, and down here you've got Tennessee. I think I put down, no, I don't have them there. I thought I had a map showing the surrounding area. I guess it was the rivers I had. Okay, never mind. So again, Missouri, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, West Virginia, and Tennessee. You do need to know that. Now, actually, it was the Shawnee Indians, the Ohio Indians, who had lived here at one time and moved on. But they were the biggest threat to the settlers in Kentucky. And sometimes, instead of using the boogeyman to scare the kids, parents would say, you better be careful, the Shawnee will get you. Then you have a brief mention of Mary Draper Ingalls and Virginia Sellers Wiley, who'd been captured by the Indians and escaped. And it doesn't go into a lot of detail in there, but the books that they wrote about their escapades or their capture kind of bloody in a lot of detail. And the main thing you need to know is the fact that there were females captured, and although they were not always used sexually, they would be used as a slave. They could be made to cook or to clean or do various things, because to an Indian, it didn't matter what color the person's skin was. They had a function to perform, whether it was to be a sexual partner, whether it was to be weaving cloths or making moccasins. You had a job to do, and you had to do it. But they did manage to escape, and they managed to tell a lot about the geography of the area, although they were not in Kentucky. They were in Western Virginia at the time. And your statement in your last, toward the end of that little section in your text says, pioneer women face the same dangers as their men, but we know very little about them. So I ask you, why? Well, quite obviously, the answer is history was written by old white men, and women were considered second-class citizens. And if you were to read some of the earlier histories, you'd think that it was just the white male that did anything. The Hispanics didn't do anything. The Indians didn't do anything. Women didn't do anything. The African Americans didn't do anything. Whoever writes the histories writes it from their point of view. But the women were right there alongside the men. They faced the same dangers, and they had to shoot Indians and everything else to stay alive. And they deserve a lot more credit than credit has been given. Although when we get into the section of the text about women's contribution, it relates several really cute and funny stories about some Kentucky women. The Long Hunters. The picture on the top right is supposed to be a painting of Squire Boone, which was Daniel's brother, heading out of the Cumberland Pass. And as you can see, he's got a pack animal on the back of the pack animal. He's got all of his skins. The one on the lower right is supposed to be a reconstruction of the type of lean-to they would build. Sometimes they would put leaves and branches over the tops of these, branches right here to try to keep out the weather, but most of the time it was just what little bit that you could get. Or they would put things on the top to keep away from the animals. But the reason they're called long hunters is because they were gone a long time, and they had that old Kentucky long gun. And folks, I was so disappointed when I discovered that the Kentucky long rifle was really made in Pennsylvania. It's like learning that the Kentucky bluegrass isn't native to Kentucky. It just destroys your faith in everything. But these long hunters would enter through the Cumberland Gap, and by the 1760s, there's several dozen of them already in here. And the Indians don't take kindly to this, because they thought that they were just coming in and they were just coming after the skins. And once in a while, they would take the heart or the tongue of an animal, the premier parts, and they just leave the rest of it to rot. Well, the Indians didn't like this, so they would sometimes come upon you and they would take your skins, and they usually gave you something, a knife or something, so that you could make it back to civilization. But if you got hostile, you got caught doing it more than one time, they didn't just take your skins, they'd take your scalp. But the long hunters were wasteful in their point of view because of them just wanting the skins. Now, the vision you have in mind of a long hunter is that he was dirty, smelly, unshaven, hair long, drank whiskey, rough type character. And that is exactly the opposite of what he was, because he was a very clean, sober man. He was healthy. He was very literate. He was clean. Think about it. If you're out hunting and you're hundreds of miles away from anybody else, and animals and Indians depend upon the sense of smell to hunt, and if they can smell you, they're going to know where you are. So keeping clean was what you needed to do, and they took baths as frequently as they could. Sober, if you get drunk, you're going to wake up dead without a scalp, or the bears are going to get you. Yes, they carried whiskey, but they carried it for medicinal purposes. So they had to be healthy, because if they broke their leg, they're going to have to set it themselves. If they got a bad tooth, they're going to have to pull it themselves. So consequently, they brushed their teeth. No, they didn't have store-bought toothbrushes and Colgate toothpaste. They would take an old stick off of a tree somewhere and rub it over their teeth to clean the teeth. And most of them were literate. I mean, being alone was bad enough, but if you could read the Bible, and they all carried a journal. That way you could find out, remember where you'd been and how many sins you got, and if something happened to you and you got killed, if they found your body, they'd find your journal and they'd know what was going on. But the long hunter has a very bad rap, and it's not deserved. And I know when I was there on campus, we had a gentleman used to come in and do the presentation of a long hunter, and he would show the students what an actual camp was like. And I looked and looked for the pictures I took myself to try to post some, and I haven't been able to find them, but I'm going to continue to look. Randy King, he's an employee there at OCC. And one of the things that surprised the students was how much equipment you could carry. And you carried one pan and one cup. But to drink, you had your canteen, and there's a little brief YouTube thing I want you to see that explains what the long hunter wore and why. And their drink of choice, believe it or not, was coffee or hot chocolate. And no, we didn't have ground coffee and Lipton tea bags. It looked like about the size of a baseball. And it looked like a dirty snowball. And they would cut off or shave off a few slivers of the tea or the hot chocolate and put it in boiling water, and they'd have their drink. Like I said, the whiskey was not for drinking, because you had to stay sober, stay alive. Good old Daniel Boone. This is one of the most famous paintings of him. He did not pose for it. It was done from memory. Let's talk a little bit about Daniel Boone. And some of the information I'm going to give you is not in the text, but that's okay. Trying to find in my notes where I am. Okay. He was a third-generation Quaker. I think your text says he was Irish and Scots. Born in Pennsylvania, and he lived there, and he had very little schooling. His mother really taught him how to read, and his dad taught him how to hunt. But he was hard to discipline, and one of the stories I heard about him was that when he did something wrong, his dad, of course, would spank him because of corporal punishment. And now you youngsters don't believe in this, but people of my generation and older, corporal punishment was the way to go. And his dad would hit him with a stick or with a belt until they started crying. Well, Daniel Boone was just contrary enough. He wouldn't cry. No matter how many times his dad hit him, he would not cry. Of course, as soon as he started crying, his dad would stop. But he was just contrary. But he loved to hunt. And he learned how to hunt very early. He became well known even though he was young. And at about 15, your text mentions that he and his family moved from Pennsylvania to North Carolina. But it doesn't tell you why. I'm going to tell you why. And it's strictly gossip. It seems that Boone and his family had become, shall we say, a source of controversy in the local Quaker community, because two of his older siblings had married outside the community. And then Boone's parents were fussed at in the church and compelled to publicly apologize, especially when their oldest daughter, Sarah, married a non-Quaker, and the couple had been keeping company, and she had a child within 6 months. So the church considered them having been keeping company and marrying without the benefit of clergy, and was going to shun them. And since they were expelled from the Quaker way of life, Squire Boone stood by him, and the whole family packed up and moved. They said they weren't going to be shunned. So it was not considered the thing to do to have a baby in less than 9 months. Boone never went back to church again. He had all of his children baptized. He became a wagoner during the French and Indian War in 1755, and a year later, he'd already met Rebecca, and of course, there's a lot of cute stories about how he met her. Uh, they say she was a beautiful woman with long red hair, very dedicated wife, and they eventually had 10 children. Of course, they didn't all live, but Rebecca did her good job. She stayed at home while he went out hunting. And according to Boone, he was pretty happy. He said all you needed was a good gun, a good horse, and a good wife, and he had all three. But he's got wanderlust a little bit. So he had been married that many years, just 9 years, and he takes a trip to Florida. Now, you get 2 or 3 different versions of this. Some say he bought land down there. Some say he went down there and he did not like it because of the mosquitoes, and the Indians weren't even as friendly in Florida as they were in North Carolina, and that wasn't friendly at all. And they had those big green crawly creatures on the ground called alligators. So one story is that he did not want to stay because of the heat and the animals. Another story is that Rebecca says, I'm not leaving this area to go that far. So he did not move to Florida. A couple of years later, he starts on his hunting trips into Kentucky. In '69, he took a 2-year hunting trip with some friends, and your text gives you a little bit more detail. And of course, the Indians caught him and took the skins. They come back home, and Boone stays. When they returned to try to find him or his body, they found him singing under a tree. And the first time I took a Kentucky history course and read that story, I cannot believe that a frontier man like Boone would do that. But that was before I learned that the long hunters were literate and they were clean, and singing was not out of the realm of possibility. Of course, it is, quote, a folk story, quote. Well, 71, the hunting party has got a lot of furs and skins and stuff, and they're heading home, and the Indians take the skins again. So basically, Boone's been hunting twice in Kentucky, and both times he lost his skins, but both times the Indians let him go with just a warning, and actually, although with no horse, they gave him, something to eat and a knife so he could make it back home. And I think your text relates the story of how Squire and Daniel tried to steal their horses back, but they got caught again. 2 years later, Captain William Russell, who had been served in the French and Indian War, had received as pay a land grant in Kentucky. So he asked Boone to lead him and his family into Kentucky, and I think there was about 50 of them in the party. And the party was set up in 3 different sections. The first section was the settlers with the babies and all. The second section it only had 8 people in it, but it was mostly animals and a few supplies. And then the third section was a little bit later with the rest of the supplies. Well, Indians attacked the second party and killed 7 of them. And they say that Boone and Russell's son were tortured to the point where they were begging for death, and they were finally killed. It was not a good death. I just can't even imagine what it'd be like to find or to have to bury your son. Wait a minute, I think that little YouTube I've got where I've got a short one of an impersonator doing Boone, and I think he relates the story of that, if I remember right. But the first attempt to settle in Kentucky was a total, complete failure. But he became a legend. Why? Because of a man called John Filson from Minnesota. He was a land speculator. He was a former school teacher. So land speculator, came to Kentucky to map the area, to make claims, and to sell land, plain, pure, and simple. And while he was wandering around doing things, he heard about this man called Daniel Boone, and he was interested, and he went to interview Colonel Boone. And he wrote just a couple of pages about him in the back of his book of maps, and had it published in England, and it was translated into German and French. And Boone became the quintessential frontier man in Europe, and everyone thought that the pioneer man in the West was just like Daniel Boone. As a matter of fact, he was probably better known in Europe than he was 20 miles from where he lived. But I guess I should have put a map up here. In your mind, France is claiming all of Canada, all the Mississippi River Valley, and all the Ohio Valley. And why they wanted it is primarily because that river running all the way from Canada down to the Gulf, they needed it for trade, for the Indians that they traded with, and for the settlers and the French settlers, and also for transportation and communication to their little old settlement called New Orleans down there in the Gulf. And they would build forts along the way. And of course, we know them as towns now, but the 4 I've got mentioned, Detroit, Fort Kaskaskia, Fort Vincennes, Fort Cahokia, Fort Detroit. These were originally forts. They even planted iron plates in the ground in what we have called Eastern Kentucky, claiming ownership because Marquette and Joliet and LaSalle had explored for France and discovered the Mississippi and all that area. And meanwhile, England also was claiming 200 miles north and south of the old Point Comfort and from sea to sea, and all the lands touched by water originating in these areas. It's going to later include the area we know as Kentucky, Tennessee, Ohio, Illinois, Michigan, and even more. Virginia is claiming a bunch of land. And Virginia also is sending explorers out to explore. So, you know, when you think about it, the Ohio Valley, which is all the area north of the Ohio and east of the Mississippi River, diplomats wanted it, generals wanted it, countries wanted it. Of course, the generals wanted to protect their colonies. I mean, the French wanted to protect their colonies. The English wanted to protect their colonies. Diplomats wanted it because we can make trade. And the countries themselves, of France and England, the more land you claim, the more important you are. But these two nations, England and France, they had been at war numerous times over the decades and centuries, and now they're getting testy over the ownership of the Ohio Valley. So it doesn't take much to realize there is some problems. There's some trouble brewing big time. We have a very young, Scottish, arrogant governor of Virginia, whose name is Dimwittle, and you do not have to remember it. I just like saying his name, Dimwittle. He sent George Washington, a very green, young, inexperienced man. But let's face facts, the French didn't like the English. They had no respect for them. And under normal conditions, a representative from the colony of Virginia would not have been welcomed in Canada. But Washington, he's tall. He's over 6 foot tall. He's got this white wig on, these big blue eyes, and he looks so good in that blue uniform. And beside that, he's a very wealthy plantation owner. So they did welcome him, and he was to, according to Governor Dimwittle, tell them to get out of Fort Duquesne, which is right at the headwaters of the Ohio River, place called Pittsburgh, and by the way, get out of the rest of Ohio. Well, it didn't happen, and your text doesn't go into the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War, and I'm not going to spend too much time on it either. But it is the beginning of the 7 Years' War, what's known as Europe and the French and Indian War here, primarily because France had Indian allies and England had allies. And the first major battle was a disastrous defeat for England. And the only reason I've even mentioned is because Boone, Daniel Boone, and a man called Finley were there. They were wagon drivers at the time. And Boone had enough sense to realize that we had a very brash, egotistical, pardon the expression, I don't think a nice way to say it. Well, he wasn't a very nice man, and he did not like the colonials. You know, if they could have made it at home, they would have had to come to the New World. He looked down on them, and even though Washington and all the natives were trying to explain to them that the French were fighting what they called Indian style, they didn't just stand up in a line and shoot and then kneel down with the line behind them shot. They would hide behind trees and shoot and then run like crazy. Well, no self-respecting military would do that, and he didn't believe them, and he sent his men in a single file into a wood, and hey, guess what? Even though they were outnumbered 6-1, the French were hiding behind trees and shooting and running. So it was a disastrous defeat, but Boone saw what was happening, and he supposedly has cut the traces of his horses to the wagon and took off running like crazy. So he survived. But it was an English win eventually, and Treaty of Paris, it's one of those rare times when things don't go back to the way they were before the war. It used to make me so mad when I read about a war and people die and property is destroyed, and then when the war ends, everything goes back to the way it was before. But this one didn't. England wanted France totally out of North America, and the Treaty of Paris, signed at Versailles, by the way. England got all of known Canada, all the land east of the Mississippi River, and Florida. France is completely out. Completely out. By the way, did you all read Evangeline in high school? It's a long story. I think a Longfellow wrote it about a little place called Arcadia in Canada, right after the 7 Years' War. the French didn't want all those Catholic French-speaking people out there, so they put them on boats. They sailed them down the Atlantic coast and landed them in New Orleans. And they are the descendants of the people we know today as Cajuns. It has nothing to do with Kentucky history, just an FYI. So all of known Canada, all the land east of Mississippi and Florida now belong to England, and France is gone. Well, then the English issued something called the Proclamation of 1763, which is the year the war ended. And it basically said no more trading with the Indians. And all Englishmen west of those mountains have to return to the other side of the mountains. No more buying land from the Indians. And man, the land speculators were just furious because they thought, well, the French are gone, the Spanish are gone. There's nobody to stop us. We can go out there and we can claim that land and we can sell it. We can make lots and lots of money. But in all honesty, the English had a plate full. First of all, they got to figure out what kind of government they're going to have in French Canada, what kind of government they're going to have in Spanish Florida, how are we going to protect our English colonists, what are we going to do about all that fur trade and about the Indians, and we've got to figure out a way to pay for this war. Okay, let's stop here just a minute. You may be confused. Just a few months before the war ended, France's ally, Spain, which is also a Catholic country because Spain is Catholic, France is Catholic, and England is Protestant. Spain sided with France. Now, Spain never sent any soldiers to the New World to fight. All she did was give some aid and comfort, so to speak, to the French. But technically, since she had sided with France, she was in the war and had lost too. So when we took Canada from France, we had to take Florida, Spanish Florida, from the Spanish because, they lost the war too. Well, I think some calmer, cooler heads got thinking and wondering what's going on, and they decided, all that land west of the Mississippi, for goodness sakes, there's no way we can control it. I've got an idea. Why don't we give that little colony of New Orleans there on the Gulf, which we took from the French, give it to Spain and tell her she can have everything west of the Mississippi, which she's claiming anyway. Well, this was going to work out. This is going to work out fine. We've got everything east of the Mississippi, including Florida, for now. For now. It's not going to last. So that's one problem out of the way. So the French are gone from the north. The Spanish are gone from the south. And they're still not real sure what's going on, but they're going to go along with it. But we still have to figure out how to protect the colonists because, Jiminy Christmas, there's a bunch of them here. There's close to 3 million here. And, they're just so feisty. They're land hungry. They won't stay put where they're supposed to be. So we have to figure out how to protect them. So we have to leave some English soldiers here because we didn't have the police force at that time. The fur trade's still up in the air, but the Indians, that's a different story, you see. Darn it all. The Indians were going to be a problem. The English were a bit sanctimonious. They looked down on anyone who wasn't English, white, male, and Protestant. And, of course, the Indian didn't fit but one of those. They were males, but they did not fit the color classification for the skin, and they sure weren't Christians. So they were considered heathens, and the Indians, as far as the English were concerned, should be exterminated. Even the Pilgrims were glad when they died off from smallpox. But the French, on the other hand, they treated the Indians with dignity. They lived in their villages. They married their women. They brought them gifts when they came to visit. And the Indians really liked the French. Well, the English aren't stupid. They're just sanctimonious. And they decided, we're going to have to be nice to the Indians, because if we don't, all the Indians are going to side with the French, and we're going to be alone out here. So we got to decide, what are we going to do with the Indians, because now the French are gone, and we don't have to be nice anymore. And we also got to figure out some way to pay for this war. That's when they started passing all those taxes, and it really got everybody upset. So the war is over, 1763, and we got land companies. there's several formed, but the two biggest was the Ohio and the Ohio Land Company and the Loyal Land Company. The Ohio Land Company was formed in 1747, about the time, a little bit before the French and Indian War started. And Thomas Lee founded it, and the only reason I mention his name is because, well, he's of the Virginia Lees, the very famous Virginia Lees, and which we're going to hear about later. Governor Dimwittle, my little Scottish man, who, don't you just love his name? And Augustine Washington were some of the founders. And the reason I mention Augustine Washington, because he's George's father. They applied for and got a grant of 200,000 acres, and the deal was they had to settle 100 settlers and build a fort within 7 years. And if they did all this, they would gain 300,000 more acres. But the irony is it wasn't even in Kentucky. It was in Western Virginia. But they hired Christopher Gist to survey. The company kind of went kaput in the 1790s. They just couldn't seem to get their act together, even though they had some other famous people in it. But the Loyal Land Company was formed by several big kahunas. The Speaker of the House of Burgesses, which had a lot of influence, John Robinson, and Edmund Randolph of the Virginia Randolphs. As a matter of fact, he's going to be the one of the relatives of Thomas Jefferson's wife. They got a grant of 800,000 acres, but they had basically the same stipulation. You've got to settle 100 settlers in 7 years, etc. Now, they hired Dr. Thomas Walker to survey, and Dr. Thomas Walker, although is a very famous man, he's not from Kentucky, and the only time he was really in Kentucky was when he was surveying, but we thank him because, well, it's because of him we know about the Cumberland Pass and the Cumberland River, and they already had Indian names, but when he found them, he just changed their names to name them after a very famous lord in England. And your book gives you a few more details about that. They left in March of 1750, and they even got as far as a couple of miles from the bluegrass area, but they built a little cabin and planted some stuff. Then they turned around and went back, and on the way back, they discovered there's a lot of settlement going on in Western Virginia. 3 years later, he actually became director of the company. But neither the Loyal Company or the Ohio Land Company was ever able to make any permanent settlement. What they did do is they stimulated interest. They also helped gain geographical knowledge. But it's going to be the normal guy, the normal settler, like you and me, that's going to be able to make Kentucky home and make it desirable and make the first permanent settlement. Well, I would be far. Okay. Sorry about that, folks. Got a heavy finger. As I said earlier, the French had been nice to the natives, and the Indians were not nice. I thought they were heathens and beneath their contempt. With the French and Spanish gone, they no longer have to be nice, and England knew something was going to happen, and it did. An Indian chief by the name of Pontiac formed a rebellion that only lasted 2 years, and there were hundreds of Indians killed or sold into slavery, and there was also hundreds of white men. As a matter of fact, it nearly wiped out New England. 1772. You see, we didn't have much cash back in those days, so you were going to have to pay people either by barter system or with a land grant. And when you were in the war or you done something for the government, they paid you with a land warrant or land grant. So in 1772, surveyors entered Kentucky to survey for land grants to pay the soldiers who had been in the French and Indian War, which had ended 9 years ago. And the names I've got there is only because they're going to be hearing them again. James Harrod. Anytime you see something in red, it's good to remember it. James Harrod, Thomas Bullock, Hubbard Taylor, James, Robert, and George McPhee. Harrod, somewhere along the line, leaves the group. They don't know for sure why, but he did. Well, they get back, and the survey is not accepted. Colonel Preston, who is surveyor for Fincastle County, which includes all of Kentucky and Western Virginia, because we're part of Virginia, sends the survey team back again. And they get to the Falls of Ohio, and some search for Harrod because they don't know whether he's dead or whether he's been captured by the Indians or whether what happened to him. He's just gone. They really thought they were going to find him dead. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, as they say, Governor Dimwittle is no longer with us. And the new governor that took over is not nearly as interesting or have nice a name. His name is Dunmore. Governor Lord Dunmore. He's fearing the Indians are going to go on the warpath, so he sends Boone and Stoner out to warn these surveyors. Well, by the time Boone and Stoner get there, the surveyors are ready to come back. It seems that the Shawnee are very angry with the white man, the English white man. But not only did we not follow treaties, but we were killing game indiscriminately, and we were affecting their lifestyle. Well, while this is going on, Governor Dunmore also goes to the Pennsylvania colony to stopped their expansion into the Ohio Valley. It belongs to Virginia. So we have a dispute between the English colony of Virginia, which is encompassing more land than you could possibly ever control, and the colony of Pennsylvania, which is not really all that big, but it gets to be quite a hassle. He's claiming all that land for Virginia, and Pennsylvania's not happy. So Governor Dunmore decides he's got this taken care of. He's got people in place. Now he's going to break the Indians' power. So he gets up an expedition. And there again, I got names listed. Some of them are listed in your text, and some of them are in red. Isaac Shelby, William Russell, William Williams, William Preston, Samuel McDowell, William Christian. William was a very popular name. James Harrod and George Rogers Clark. And the three in red, Isaac Shelby is going to end up being our first governor and also a hero during the Revolutionary War. James Harrod we've already heard about. I'll tell you more about him next lesson. George Rogers Clark is one of my very favorite people in history, and you'll hear a lot about him. Meanwhile, although they're in the group with Governor Dunmore has set up, a man named William Lewis takes 1,300 men from the colonies in the far out in the frontier and starts coming down. And Cornstalk, the Shawnee chief, attacks them. Yeah, as near as we can tell, there's between 300 and 1,100 Indians. We know of at least 1,300 plus Indians, so we're looking at probably more than 2,000 of the white frontiersmen. And why is the discrepancy between 300 and 1,100? Well, number one, the Indians didn't keep very good records. And if they were dead, you can't talk to them. We know there was at least 300, and we calculate and figure at least 1,100. But whatever it was, it's a foregone conclusion. There was more white men with guns and more guns and bows and arrows. The Indians were going to lose. And they did, and Cornstalk called a halt to the war and signed a treaty of Camp Charlotte. I mean, in it there were very strenuous agreements. They had to return all their hostages and all the horses and slaves and any valuable goods that they'd stolen, and they could no more come below the south of the Ohio River to hunt. So it looked like, for right now, it looks like maybe the Indian problem is over with. That's good. Now, the French and Indian War had ended England's claims of sea to sea. We now acknowledge that claiming just to the Mississippi River is going to be a lot of land. And we go into Kentucky's boundaries as of 1763, which is the end of the French and Indian War. To the west, of course, is the Mississippi River, which is our western boundary. To the north is the Ohio River. That makes sense. You've got two rivers. To the east, I'll show you where they are in a minute. To the east is Big Sandy River or Tug Creek. And to the south, of course, the future state of Tennessee. So basically, we're boxed in, and we've got that, what I call a big camel's hump in the middle. Okay, here's what I'm talking about. It says a Tug Fork, but it really is called a Big Sandy right here between us and Virginia. Here you've got the Ohio River. Actually, it goes off about here. It doesn't come over this far. You've got the Ohio River to the north. You've got, this is the Tennessee River, comes down from Ohio into Kentucky and stays in Tennessee. The Cumberland River comes from Kentucky down into Tennessee and comes back up. So you've got the Cumberland River, you've got the Tennessee River, and of course this is the LBL down in through here. Over here you've got a little teeny tiny part of Mississippi, you've got the Ohio, you've got Big Sandy, and right here you've got something called the Kentucky River. Right here it is. It comes all the way down from the Ohio River, goes almost all the way down to the end of the state. It branches off right here. But the Kentucky River and the Lickey River, both coming off of on the Ohio River. Right in here is where most of the settlements were. And of course, this one I call the Humpy Back. Yeah, we've got the Rough River and the Green River. We don't need to know those, but you do need to know the Mississippi, the Ohio, the Kentucky, the Lickey, and Big Sandy. Cumberland, in and out, and Tennessee. You do need to know those rivers. When you use the Ohio River as a border, it's going to cause problems, especially between the future states of Ohio, Indiana, and Kentucky. And of course, most recently, the battle has been because of that proposed gambling river boat issue. The casino boats, we good Christians in Kentucky think we shouldn't have it. But the agreement finally was that each state could use the Ohio River and claim 100 feet, not feet, 100 feet into the river. Kentucky actually claims the 1792 low water mark on the north bank. So we think we get this problem with the Ohio settled and turn around, and very shortly we're going to have problems, big problems, with the Mississippi River. So basically this concludes our brief trip through chapters 1 and 2, and it's a total of 23 pages for 2 chapters. So each lesson will consist of 2 chapters, and there'll be a lecture and 1 or 2 YouTube presentations with each lesson. And with this one, I think you've got 2. You've got one with Boone and what is the other one? I don't remember, but I've got 2 on the lesson plan. So when you read the lesson and your chapter in your text, and you've listened to my lecture, and you watched your YouTubes, and you feel pretty comfortable with the information, take the quiz and the graded assignment. I caution you, you can only enter these assignments 1 time, and each of them are timed. At the end of the time, you will not be kicked off. But it keeps track of the time, and so just continue on. If you want to stop because you run out of time, 30 minutes is up, and you've still got 2 questions to go, that's your decision. But I will not have you kicked off. I will just deduct a couple of points for being late. So again, thank you, and welcome to Kentucky History.